Before we dive in, hit subscribe, drop a like and leave a comment, because what you're about to hear from inside Pelican Bay is one of the darkest real prison investigations ever recorded. The steel doors of Pelican Bay's security housing unit slammed shut with the heavy echo of a place built to bury noise, hope, and motion. The blue-tinted lights gave the corridor a permanent coldness, washing over concrete floors and metal doors that trapped some of the most dangerous inmates in the U.S. prison system. Surveillance cameras blinked with red dots, humming quietly above every cell block, but today something about their silence felt heavier. A lockdown had lasted the entire night after a disturbance on B-Pod, muffled shouting, a sudden alarm, and then complete silence. The inmates in the SHU were used to chaos, but the kind that erupted last night wasn't normal. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was calculated. Officer Marlowe, 20 years in high-security units, walked the tier with a practiced eye. He caught the details others ignored. A scrape on a door, a dent in steel, a reflection in the surveillance glass that didn't belong. Today he felt tension riding beneath every footstep. Inside cell 213, inmate Leon Blue Ink Ramirez paced with restless energy. His tattoos, ink crawling up his arms, neck and jawline, shifted with every step. Ramirez wasn't talking through the vents like usual. He wasn't throwing jabs at guards. He was watching, listening, waiting. 2 cells down, Victor Dane sat on the edge of his bunk, arms covered in faded prison ink, his eyes fixed on nothing but the floor. Dane rarely showed emotion, but the tight rhythm of his bouncing leg betrayed his nerves. Something had rattled the pod last night, and the inmates felt it before the staff ever would. Marlowe finally reached the cell that had triggered the alarm, cell 219, home to Raymond Cortez. Cortez was loud on any normal day, but last night he had gone quiet. Too quiet. Even the inmates whispered about it through the vents. Marlowe knocked. No movement. Officer Arciniega tried next. Cortez. Step forward. Still nothing. Marlowe slid the key into the lock. Every inmate nearby stopped talking. Even Ramirez paused mid-pace. The heavy steel door opened with a slow groan. Cortez lay on the floor, breathing faintly, tattoos covering every inch of visible skin. No visible injury. No weapon. No sign of struggle. But Marlowe quickly spotted something wrong. A faint, slick streak on the concrete, soap, leading from the sink to the door, and ending beneath the vent where inmates whispered deals, warnings, and coded messages during lockdown. Cortez didn't clean anything. The soap trail didn't belong. As medical staff rolled Cortez out, Ramirez leaned into his food slot. "That wasn't an accident, boss," he whispered. "He was talking to someone last night. Someone who ain't supposed to be here." Marlowe stared through the slot. "Who?" Ramirez stepped back into the dark. "Check your cameras. If they were even real last night." That landed harder than a threat. It was a clue. Inside the control room, Sergeant Elora Hayes stood over a bank of monitors. The feed for cell 219 was black. Hayes played the footage from the missing hours. It wasn't broken. It was looped. A perfect 1-second clip repeating for 4 hours. Cortez sitting upright, unmoving, the same drip from the sink, the same flicker from the light. Someone inside Pelican Bay had overridden surveillance in the SHU, a place designed so that even breathing felt monitored. Who was on rotation last night? Marlowe asked. Hayes pulled access logs. 5 minutes later, she found the first anomaly. A guard badge had been used to access B-Pod at 11:22 p.m. Officer Cole Draven. But Draven was homesick. Nowhere near the prison. Marlowe felt the weight of the discovery press against the room. "Someone used a guard's badge," he said, "and entered the SHU during lockdown." Hayes nodded. "And they disabled a camera while Cortez was talking to someone through the vent." Marlowe leaned in, voice low. "This wasn't an inmate accident. Someone planned this." Back in the pod, Victor Dane finally sat upright on his bunk. His tattooed hands tightened into fists. He had heard whispers through the vents last night, voices that didn't match anyone on the tier. He'd heard the sound of metal scraping, a soft thud, and then Cortez's breathing go quiet. Something was happening inside Pelican Bay. Something orchestrated. Something dangerous. Not an escape. Not a riot. Something worse. And the guards had stepped back just enough for it to begin. A sudden shout echoed down the corridor. "Sergeant! You need to see this. Another cell, now." An alarm chirped. Officers rushed. Inmates rose from bunks, tattoos shifting under fluorescent blue light. Something else had been found. Something that proved the chaos wasn't beginning. It was already unfolding. and Pelican Bay was about to break open in ways no one inside those steel walls was prepared for. The second alarm of the morning tore through the SHU like a blade, sharp and urgent. Officer Marlowe was already moving before the echo reached the end of the corridor. He knew Pelican Bay too well. Alarms didn't stack like this unless something deeper had taken root, something organized, intentional, and dangerous. When he reached cell 221, Officer Arciniega was standing rigid, jaw tight. The door was still locked, but a thin line of powder lay beneath it, gray dust, barely visible until the blue lights caught it. Cement dust, Marlowe muttered. Arciniega nodded. Came from the vent. Inside, inmate Harlan Price sat on the floor, tattooed arms resting on his knees. His stare was steady, unbothered, too calm for the chaos unfolding around him. The concrete surrounding the vent had been scraped away, just enough to make someone think about possibilities. Price lifted his chin. Someone was feeling around last night, he said. Not me. You didn't hear anything? Marlowe asked. Price smirked. Everyone heard something. It was the same answer Marlowe had gotten from half the pod already. Everyone heard something, but no one was naming who or what. Sergeant Hayes arrived a moment later, her expression set in the cold, analytical focus that had made her one of Pelican Bay's strongest investigators. She crouched near the vent, brushing the dust with a gloved hand. This wasn't internal, she said quietly. A tool was used. Something narrow, metal, not from inside. Marlowe felt the same sinking weight he had felt in Cortez's cell. Someone accessed this row during lockdown. And they weren't improvising, Hayes said. This was precise. Word of the discovery spread fast. Inmates shifted on their bunks, tattooed silhouettes leaning toward vents, toward the cracks beneath their doors. The SHU thrived on silence, but now silence carried meaning. A message, a warning, a plan. Hayes stepped aside. We're interviewing every inmate on the row. Marlowe knew how useless that usually was. Prisoners lied even when they had nothing to gain. But today? Today felt different. There was fear under the surface. Tattooed men who didn't flinch at solitary confinement were sitting too still, watching too carefully. The first interrogation took place in the small interview booth at the end of the tier. Thick plexiglass separated officer from inmate. Ramirez, blue ink, was the first one brought in. He leaned back in the chair, tattoos crawling across his neck like moving shadows. His eyes never left the camera in the ceiling. You saw something, Marlowe said. Ramirez chuckled. Everyone saw something. You said Cortez talked to someone who wasn't supposed to be here. And you figured that out quick, huh? Ramirez said, tapping his fingers. But you're still not asking the right question. Marlowe frowned. Which is? Ramirez's voice dropped to a low whisper, barely above the hum of the speakers. Why would someone risk coming into the most locked-down part of the most locked-down prison in the country? What's worth that risk? Before Marlowe could push further, Ramirez leaned back and closed his eyes. Interview over. By midday, every inmate had been questioned. Dane said he heard metal. Price said he heard movement. Others mentioned whispers in a voice they didn't recognize. No one had a face. No one had a name. Hayes and Marlowe walked toward the control center, both lost in thought. We're missing something, Hayes said. Something small. The control center was quiet except for the hum of servers. Hayes pulled up the access logs again. Every badge entry into the SHU during the lockdown. There it was again, Officer Cole Draven's ID. Logged into the B-pod gate. Logged into the SHU entrance. Logged into the control door. Draven had been on medical leave for 3 days. If someone cloned a badge, Marlowe said, why choose Draven? Hayes typed rapidly. Because Draven is one of 3 guards with SHU override clearance. If you want to disable surveillance, you'd need his access level. Marlowe nodded slowly. So whoever came in had detailed knowledge. Which means either a member of staff, or someone working with one. The air in the room thickened. Staff corruption was the one thing Pelican Bay feared more than inmate uprisings. Inmates were predictable. They worked in patterns. But a guard undermining security? That could fracture the entire structure. As Hayes expanded the logs, another anomaly appeared. A maintenance request submitted at 10:14 p.m., camera flicker, B-pod, filed under a name neither of them recognized. Hayes clicked it. Denied. But the request had been made from inside the prison network. Someone tried to create a cover, she said, to make a camera outage look routine. Marlowe rubbed his jaw. Whoever came and used the vent to pass something. Or retrieve something. Hayes pointed at the screen. And we don't know what. Back on the tier, the tension was spreading. Tattooed inmates paced cells, tapping on doors, talking through vents with urgency. Dane stood at his door, arms crossed, eyes locked on Marlowe as he walked past. "You can feel it, can't you?" Dane said through the slot. "Something's wrong in here." "What do you know?" Marlowe asked. Dane stepped forward, the blue light cutting across the ink on his face. "I know someone made a deal with someone they shouldn't have. I know Cortez wasn't the only one involved. And I know you, the guards, weren't supposed to find him when you did." Marlowe tensed. "Meaning?" Dane smirked. "Meaning you interrupted something." The silence between them carried weight. When Marlowe reached the end of the tier, Hayes called him from the control room again, her voice sharp. "There's another looped camera feed." Marlowe froze. "Where?" Hayes's reply came through the radio like a punch. "Outside the staff entrance." A camera looped on the outside meant only one thing. Whoever entered the SHU wasn't a single infiltrator. It was part of something larger. Something coordinated. Something still active inside Pelican Bay. And then another detail appeared on the screen, small, almost missed. A shadow in the looping clip. Faint. Barely shape. But moving. Not part of the original footage. Meaning someone had passed that camera. During the loop. Marlowe stared at the image, the weight of realization sinking into him. Someone was inside the prison with the ability to appear on no cameras at all. And whatever they were doing, they weren't done. The investigation had only just begun. And Pelican Bay was sliding toward a breaking point no one could see coming. The next morning at Pelican Bay began with the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt staged. Manufactured. As if the entire prison was holding its breath. Inside the SHU corridor, fluorescent lights flickered against the polished concrete floors, casting a pale blue glow that made the air feel colder. Officers walked slower than usual. Inmates watched more carefully. Every sound, a metal door slamming, a radio crackling, seemed louder than it should have been. Lieutenant Carrillo stepped into the corridor with 2 investigators at his side. He hadn't slept. The pressure from Sacramento was already rising. 5 hours earlier, he had filed a preliminary incident report about the missing guard keys, the disconnected cameras, and the quiet movement among tattooed inmates who clearly knew more than they were saying. Now he needed answers fast. The investigative team made their first stop at D Block, where inmate Dixon, broad-shouldered, covered in faded blue-black tattoos, sat alone in his cell, staring at the far wall. Dixon rarely spoke to staff, but he was the last inmate seen near the area before the camera feed cut out. Carrillo tapped the bars lightly. "Dixon. Step forward." The inmate didn't move at first. Only after several seconds did he stand, slowly as if calculating every step. His arms were sleeved in ink, symbols, faces, dates, and his eyes stayed fixed on Carrillo with a calm that felt too controlled. "You were on tier last night when the system went dark," Carrillo said. "What did you see?" Dixon shrugged. "Lights went out. Nothing else. Someone stole a set of keys. Not my problem." Carrillo leaned in. "Somebody's feeding information to the tier. Somebody who knew exactly which camera would drop. If you're sitting on something and don't talk, it becomes your problem." For a moment, Dixon's expression flickered, barely visible, but enough to show that something had rattled him. He stepped closer to the bars and spoke quietly. "You're looking at the wrong people, Lieutenant. Whatever's coming, it's already past you." Then he backed into the shadows. Carrillo clenched his jaw. The inmates weren't scared of punishment. They were scared of something else. By noon, internal tensions had spread through the entire facility. In the chow hall, inmates whispered in tight clusters, tattoos visible under rolled sleeves. Guards noted unusual behavior, certain men switching tables, passing coded glances, spreading themselves in positions that looked strategic rather than social. Officer Hale, on duty for the first time since the lockdown, reported to the command center with shaking hands. He kept replaying the moment investigator Morales had found that piece of cloth through the vent in cell 217. He couldn't explain it, but he felt watched ever since. Inside the command center, large blue-tone surveillance screens displayed every angle of Pelican Bay, except the one that still malfunctioned. Technicians had pulled the housing apart twice, yet the looping static continued as if someone was overriding the feed from inside the wall. Morales stood beside Carrillo reviewing the previous night's timestamps. "You said the key ring was missing at 1832, she said. "Right. And the camera died at 1836. 4 minutes apart," Carrillo added. "That's too clean to be random." Morales nodded. "Someone rehearsed this." Carrillo froze. Rehearsed, or they had help? The room fell silent. No one wanted to voice it, but every guard had already thought it. Someone on staff might be involved. The team moved next to the workshop area, a location inmates could access only under escort. All equipment was numbered and logged. But one welded tool was missing, a flat steel bar normally used for securing frames. Small enough to hide. Strong enough to pry a steel vent. Morales lifted the clipboard. It was signed out yesterday under Officer Rowe's initials. Carrillo stopped walking. Rowe was off shift. Not in the building. He hadn't answered his phone since morning. The investigation had a new direction and it wasn't comforting. Meanwhile, back in C Block the atmosphere shifted sharply. Inmate Torres, thin, tattooed chest and hands sharp-eyed, moved through the tier with subtle authority. Torres wasn't the biggest man in the block, but he was one of the smartest. Other inmates watched him like he carried the answers. Near the showers, Torres pulled Dixon aside. "They're putting pressure on everybody," Torres muttered. "Let them," Dixon said. "You don't get it. If the guards figure out Rowe was involved, that's not our concern. It becomes our concern if the whole block gets shut down." Dixon exhaled slowly. "We keep quiet. We wait." Torres shook his head. "No. Someone's talking. Someone's feeding staff more than they should." Both men turned as an inmate down the tier suddenly shouted at a guard, slamming his fist against the bars. Another prisoner began pacing. A third started banging a cup against his door rhythmically. A coordinated distraction. But why? The guard stepped back, watching from a safe distance. This was the rule. When noise rose unexpectedly, you didn't dive in, you assessed. Chaos inside Pelican Bay could erupt in seconds. Carrillo received the alert and rushed to the tier with Morales. "What triggered this?" Morales asked. "Nothing obvious," a guard said. "It just started." Carrillo scanned the row, eyes narrowing. This wasn't random. This was messaging. Then he saw it. Torres and Dixon standing at their cell fronts, silent, still watching the guards rather than participating. As if evaluating reactions. As if timing them. A chill slid down Carrillo's spine. They were testing response behavior, how fast guards stepped in when they stepped back, who arrived first, how long backup took. This wasn't chaos. This was reconnaissance. That night, after the tier settled, Carrillo returned to the administrative wing. He finally reached Officer Rowe's emergency contact. Rowe hadn't gone home. His car wasn't in his driveway. No one had seen him since last night's shift. Carrillo closed his eyes and felt the weight settle heavily. Not only were the inmates preparing for something. Not only were keys missing. Not only was a tool gone. Now a staff member had vanished. At 10:32 p.m., Morales burst into his office holding a new report. "Lieutenant, come with me. Now." Carrillo followed her fast through the hallway into the evidence room. At the center table sat a breathable nylon bag. Inside it, a uniform shirt, a broken radio, and a single rubber grip from a standard-issue baton. All of them tagged with the same name. Officer Rowe. Carrillo stared at the items, his chest tightening. Morales spoke quietly, almost reluctantly. "These were found in a maintenance closet. The door was locked from the outside." Carrillo felt the room tilt slightly. He turned toward her. "Someone inside this prison knows exactly where Rowe is, and what he was helping with." Morales nodded. "And they're not done yet." The fluorescent lights above them buzzed, flickering just enough to cast a blue shadow across the table. Right over Rowe's name. The danger wasn't rising anymore. It was already here. And something within Pelican Bay's walls was preparing to erupt. Night settled over Pelican Bay like a weighted blanket, dense and unmoving, pressing itself into every corner of the security housing unit. The blue lighting along the tier flickered in slow pulses, casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete. It was the quietest the prison had been all day, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the kind that followed too much tension, the kind that carried unspoken truths waiting to break through the surface. Officer Ramirez wasn't supposed to still be on shift, but the investigation into the stalled door motors and the missing inmate logs had dragged him into overtime. His eyes were fixed on the monitors, replaying the same 30-second camera glitch that had sparked the day's unrest. The more he watched it, the more something felt wrong. The glitch didn't look random. It looked timed. Down in the lower pod, Lieutenant Harris stood over a metal table reviewing handwritten reports, his brow tight, his jaw set. He'd worked Pelican Bay long enough to know the rhythms of inmate behavior. Today's shift felt off from the moment roll call ended. A subtle shift in how the inmates moved, how they watched the guards, how they communicated without words. He circled one sentence in a report. Multiple inmates observed pacing before yard time. No audible communication, possible coded signaling. Harris exhaled slowly. This was more than pacing. This was coordination. Possibly orchestrated. In cell 217, Dixon sat with his arms resting on his knees, tattoos winding across his forearms like black ink stories carved into his skin. His eyes were fixed on the small vent grate above the door. A faint tap echoed from somewhere in the tier, not loud, just enough to signal the message had spread. The plan wasn't Dixon's idea, but the inmates trusted him. His long sentence and calm reputation made him a stabilizing figure, and in Pelican Bay, influence could be as powerful as force. But for the past 2 days he'd felt something twisting beneath the surface of the block, an agenda moving without him. Someone else was pulling strings. And he didn't like being kept in the dark. Back in the upper corridor, Harris walked toward the maintenance access panel that controlled the camera feeds for Block C. It looked normal from the outside, steel casing, no damage, no fingerprints. But something gnawed at him. During the glitch, every inmate had remained still as if they expected it. As if they'd been waiting. He opened the panel. Inside, the wiring was intact. But tucked between 2 cables was a small strip of folded paper. His stomach dropped. He slipped on gloves and pulled it free. The note was handwritten, the strokes sharp and hurried. When guards stepped back, we stepped forward. It wasn't signed. It wasn't addressed. It was a message, one meant to be found. As Harris studied the paper, the overhead lights dimmed then brightened again. A subtle flicker, barely noticeable. But Harris's muscles tensed. Electrical interference didn't happen here without a reason. Not in Pelican Bay. He radioed Ramirez. Check camera integrity again. Something's off. But before Ramirez could respond, the static hummed across several screens. Not fully, just a thin line of distortion running down the center of the monitors like a pulse. Ramirez stared at the feed from D block. Sir, we've got movement. Inside the tier, 2 inmates stood silently at their cell doors, watching the camera with an intensity that sent a cold ripple through Ramirez. Their tattoos glistened under the dim lighting and neither blinked. It was a warning. A message. They knew the guards were stretched thin. They knew control was shifting. Harris moved quickly through the hallway, his boots echoing in sharp bursts. He didn't run, but his walk carried urgency, the kind felt only when an officer realized the prison's balance was tipping. As he reached the control booth, Ramirez replayed the newest footage. Look, Ramirez whispered. In slow motion, the 2 inmates arrived at their doors at the exact same second. Too precise, too coordinated. A 3rd inmate stepped up moments later, slipping a piece of torn bedsheet under the crack of his door. The sheet wasn't the message, it was the signal. Dixon appeared in the corner of the frame. He didn't join them. He just watched. His expression unreadable, his posture tense as if trying to decode the plan moving around him. Ramirez shifted uneasily. Sir, this feels organized. It is organized, Harris said. Someone wants control of this block. They're testing how far they can push before we tighten the lockdown. Ramirez swallowed. What do we do? Harris stared at the monitors. We wait. They're expecting a reaction. We don't give them one. But even as he said it, the prison around them whispered with subtle signs of escalation. A door hinge softly clicked. A faint echo bounced through the vents. Somewhere deeper in the tier, a short metallic tap signaled another inmate joining the silent network. The blue lighting along the walls flickered again, this time longer. Harris felt his chest tighten. They're coordinating with the power fluctuations. Someone's accessing controls. Ramirez looked up sharply. Inside job. Or someone smart enough to exploit the gaps we didn't see, Harris answered. At the far end of the tier, Dixon finally moved. He stepped into the camera's frame, lifted his chin, and looked directly into the lens, straight at Ramirez, straight at Harris. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Just watching. As if to say, you're missing something. Harris leaned closer to the screen. Dixon wasn't signaling. He wasn't aligning with the others. He was observing the tension building around him, the shifts in behavior, the silent communication. He knew more than he was saying. The question was whether he would talk. But before Harris could finish that thought, the entire tier went black. Lights off. Cameras off. Sound gone. A total blackout. For 5 full seconds, the prison felt like a sealed box with a heartbeat. Then the emergency lights snapped on, cold, sharp, blue. Every inmate stood at their doors. Waiting. Harris stared at the screens, his pulse hammering. This isn't the chaos, he whispered. This is the countdown. The next morning, Pelican Bay felt unusually quiet, the kind of heavy silence that settles after a storm, where the walls themselves seem to be waiting for the next command. Floodlights stayed on longer than usual, sweeping across empty tiers and still-fogged windows as officers returned to their positions after the lockdown was lifted. To the outside world, nothing looked different. But inside, every inmate, every guard, and every administrator carried the weight of the last 48 hours. A moment when the balance of control had slipped just enough to expose the fragility of the entire system. For the inmates, the memory of freedom, even the illusion of it, lingered like smoke. The simple act of speaking openly across tiers, organizing without whispering, or even walking unescorted had awakened something powerful. The understanding that the system wasn't unbeatable, just rigid. But with that realization came consequences. Internal affairs arrived before sunrise, clipboards in hand, reviewing camera footage and interviewing staff. The central question was simple but dangerous. What actually happened when the guard stepped back? No one wanted to admit fault. No one wanted to be the one who allowed order to slip. In the SHU, Ramirez sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the door. He had been identified as one of the inmates who tried to negotiate peace during the chaos, a rare act that earned him neither praise nor anger, just silence. Leadership inside the block still viewed him as a thinker, not a threat, and that made him useful, but unpredictable. He didn't know what the administration would decide next. He only knew that Pelican Bay didn't forget anything, not silence, not noise, and definitely not deviation. Down the corridor, another inmate, Morris, sat through yet another interview with staff. He had tried to keep tensions low, but officers viewed him with suspicion simply because he had influence. Influence meant power, and power, even nonviolent power, was something Pelican Bay always monitored closely. On the staff side, things were no easier. Some guards were angry that others had pulled back too much. Others were frustrated that no one seemed to have a clear explanation for why the unit had been so severely understaffed in the first place. A few privately admitted the truth: they were tired. Pelican Bay wasn't a normal workplace. The stress, the long hours, the constant pressure to show strength, it built up year after year until moments like this became inevitable. But no one dared to say that out loud. The warden's meeting that afternoon was the most tense gathering Pelican Bay had seen in years. Reports were incomplete, timelines were inconsistent, and the question of accountability hung over everyone like fog drifting through razor wire. The warden, calm but visibly strained, cleared his throat before speaking. Chaos starts small. It always starts with something minor. But it's on us to make sure it never grows again. That was the official line. Unofficially, everyone in the room knew the truth. Chaos didn't start small this time. It started because the system was stretched thin, because the people inside it were exhausted, and because even the most secure prison in California couldn't run on autopilot. Night returned to Pelican Bay with a strange stillness. The corridors echoed, but faintly, as if the prison itself was holding its breath. Guards resumed normal rounds, checking cells with renewed precision. Inmates spoke softly, keeping their heads down even though their minds raced with what they had witnessed. Ramirez lay in his cell, eyes open, replaying everything in his mind: the temporary calm, the negotiations, the moment hope and fear collided. He wasn't naive. He knew the system would reset. It always did. But the memory of an unguarded moment would never disappear. For Morris, the event became a reminder not of rebellion, but of responsibility. He had seen what could happen when tension and opportunity met, and he understood that one wrong move could have ignited something irreversible. His influence inside the block, the same influence that made staff uneasy, now carried a new weight. In the administration wing, the warden finished his final report for Sacramento. It was polished, professional, and carefully structured. It explained the events without revealing the deeper truth that every officer already knew. Pelican Bay didn't experience chaos because inmates wanted it. It experienced chaos because the system underestimated how much pressure one place could hold. As the prison lights dimmed and the final preparations for the next day began, the institution seemed to settle into a new normal, one that was stable on the surface but deeply changed underneath. The guards had stepped back. The inmates had seen what that meant. And now everyone, on both sides, understood each other just a little more than before. Not trust, not friendship, but awareness. A reminder that Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison. It was a delicate ecosystem held together by routine, pressure, and the uneasy relationship between control and survival. And for the first time in a long time, everyone inside realized that the line between order and chaos is much thinner than anyone wants to admit.